I found out the way you find out about most things that destroy you, which is completely by accident during a completely ordinary moment. I was sitting in Ryan's car waiting for him to come out of a gas station, which he'd gone into to grab water. And his phone was in the cup holder between us, and it buzzed with a text from his friend Dominic that said something like, "So are you actually going through with the wedding, or is she still just for fun?" I read it 3 times. I read it the way you read something when the words are individually familiar, but the combination doesn't make sense, like your brain keeps trying to rearrange them into something less catastrophic. I put the phone face down. Ryan came out of the gas station with 2 bottles of water and a bag of chips, and he got in and handed me one, and I took it and said thank you, and we drove home, and I said nothing, and he had no idea anything had happened. He was talking about something he'd seen on the news that morning, and I was sitting in the passenger seat with a bag of water I wasn't drinking and a sentence in my head that I couldn't put down. She's still just for fun. Still. The word still was what I couldn't get past, because it implied a timeline, it implied a conversation that had happened before that conversation, it implied that this was not a new characterization but an ongoing one. That somewhere outside of my relationship there was a version of my relationship being described with words I had never heard and would never have believed. His name is Ryan Calloway, and we'd been together for 2 years and 8 months before he proposed, and together for 3 years and 2 months by the time I found that text. I'm Nadia. I'm 29. I work in marketing, and I have a tendency to overanalyze things that are going fine and underanalyze things that aren't, which is a quality I've spent years being aware of, without fully correcting. Ryan worked in finance, not the glamorous kind, the kind that involves spreadsheets and quarterly reports and a lot of complaining about clients, which I found endearing rather than boring because I dated men who were interested in nothing outside themselves, and Ryan being interested in something, even something tedious, felt like evidence of substance. We met at a rooftop party thrown by a mutual friend, the kind of party that exists specifically to facilitate meeting people you'd never encounter otherwise, and he talked to me for 2 hours about almost everything before he asked for my number. And that sequence, the conversation before the ask, was something I'd never experienced before, and it made an impression I carried into everything that came after. We dated for almost a year before anything felt serious, and then it felt serious all at once, the way things sometimes shift from casual to certain overnight, and after that the relationship built itself into my life the way good things do. Quietly and thoroughly, until removing it would have required removing a significant portion of the person I'd become around it. The proposal happened on a Thursday evening in November, which is not when you expect proposals to happen. You expect them on vacations or anniversaries or after elaborate arrangements involving restaurants with candles. And the Thursdayness of it was actually what made it so effective. He came home from work and I was already there because I'd gotten off early and was making dinner, and he walked in still in his coat and said he'd been thinking about it for a long time and he didn't want to wait for the right moment because he was worried he'd overthink it into never happening, and then he had the ring, just in his jacket pocket like he'd been carrying it around waiting for the courage. And he asked me to marry him in our kitchen while I was holding a wooden spoon and wearing an apron that had a stupid print on it, and I said yes so fast I didn't even process that I was saying it. I was just already nodding, already certain, and we stood in the kitchen for a long time just holding each other while the thing on the stove burned slightly and neither of us moved to fix it. That's the proposal I've told people about approximately 40 times since it happened. That's the version of Ryan that I put in the frame in my head that I kept next to every other frame of him that I collected over 3 years. The man who came home in his work coat on a Thursday because he didn't want to wait for perfect. Wedding planning started about 2 months after the proposal and was genuinely enjoyable for the first few weeks in the way that doing something new always is before the logistics become exhausting. We'd agreed on a small ceremony, something under 80 people, and I'd started looking at venues while Ryan handled the budget spreadsheet because that's where our respective skills landed. My best friend Priya came venue hunting with me on a Saturday, and we spent 6 hours visiting 4 different spaces and rating them on a shared notes document we titled Completely Rationally, which is a joke that required no explanation between us. Ryan came to the second venue visit and seemed present and interested, asked the right questions, had opinions about the outdoor space and the catering options. My mother liked him. His mother liked me. The two families had met twice before the engagement, and both times the dinner had gone well in the real way rather than the politely tolerated way. I had no reason to be suspicious of anything. I want to make that very clear because I've spent months since all of this wondering what I missed, and the honest answer is that I didn't miss anything obvious. The obvious things came later, and before them there was nothing that a reasonable person would have clocked as a problem. I had a fiancé who showed up, a wedding we were planning together, 2 families that seemed genuinely happy, and a friend who'd helped me rate venues on a shared document we'd named like adults. Everything was fine. The first thing that felt slightly off was about 6 weeks after the proposal. We were at a dinner with Ryan's work friends, a group I'd met a few times and felt comfortable enough around, and there was a woman there named Cassie who I'd been introduced to twice before, and who was always pleasant in a surface way that didn't go further. That night something shifted in how she looked at me, not hostile exactly, more like careful, like she was monitoring a situation, and at one point during the dinner she said something to Ryan quietly that I didn't hear. And he laughed and redirected the conversation so smoothly that I wouldn't have noticed the redirection if I hadn't already been paying attention to her. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it under things that didn't require further investigation, but I can tell you now that my body noticed it before my brain did. Because I was quieter on the drive home than I normally was after social events, and when Ryan asked if I was tired I said yes, because tired was the easiest explanation. What I actually was, though I didn't have the language for it then, was the beginning of uneasy. Something had grazed me during that dinner, and I didn't know what it was, and I let it go because you can't investigate a feeling you can't name. So I went home and I went to sleep, and in the morning everything seemed normal again, and I told myself I'd been tired. So I'm in the car. Ryan is inside buying water. I've just read Dominic's text and put the phone face down. And now I need to tell you what the 2 weeks after that car ride looked like, because I didn't confront Ryan immediately, and I want to explain why, because I know some people would have, and I'm not those people. I'm someone who needs to understand something before I try to discuss it, because if I try to discuss something I don't understand yet I just end up defending the wrong position or asking the wrong questions, and I had so many questions. What did just for fun mean specifically? Was it a joke Dominic was making? Was it an old characterization that no longer applied? Was it something Ryan had said once in a weak moment and Dominic hadn't let go of? Was it something Ryan had been saying consistently? Was it something other people also knew? I needed answers to some of those questions before I said anything, because if I confronted Ryan with nothing but a text he hadn't seen me read, he could explain it in 17 different directions and I'd have no footing. So I went quiet. I started paying attention differently. I started being the person in the room who was watching instead of just existing, and that shift in attention is when the things I'd been not noticing became very suddenly visible. I want to ask you something before I keep going, because I've thought about this decision a lot. If you'd seen that text, would you have confronted him immediately, or would you have done what I did and gone quiet to gather more information first? I'm genuinely asking because I've been told both approaches by people in my life, and I still don't know which one was better. Leave a comment if you have a take. Okay, back to the investigation phase, which is what I started calling it in my head because naming it made me feel slightly more in control. The first thing I did in the investigation phase was look more carefully at Ryan's behavior around his phone, which had not previously seemed suspicious, but which I now viewed through a different lens. He'd always been relatively private about his phone, not secretive in an obvious way, just the kind of person who didn't leave it face up on tables and didn't hand it to you to show you something without navigating there himself. I'd attributed this to general privacy preferences and never thought more about it. Looking at it now, I noticed that he tended to check his phone in the bathroom more than seemed necessary, and that when Dominic texted him he usually went somewhere briefly before responding. These could both have innocent explanations. They probably had innocent explanations. But I was in the business of noticing now, so I noticed. The second thing I did was reach out to Priya and, without telling her about the text, mention Dominic in conversation in a way that let her respond naturally, and her response was slightly interesting. She said Dominic had always seemed like the kind of person who said things he thought were funny that were actually just slightly cruel. And when I asked what she meant by that, she said she'd once overheard him at a party saying something to another guy in Ryan's friend group that struck her as weird, and she'd never been able to let it go. I asked what he'd said, and she paused long enough that I knew she was deciding how much to tell me. What Priya told me next is the thing that moved the text message from unsettling to structural. She said that about 18 months ago, before the engagement, she'd been at a party where Dominic and two other guys from Ryan's circle were talking in a corner, and she'd caught part of the conversation. Not all of it, not enough to fully understand it, but enough to hear Dominic say something about Ryan having a good thing going and not wanting to mess with it. At the time she'd interpreted this as the guys talking about the relationship positively, like Ryan was lucky to have a good thing, and she'd filed it away as a fragment without meaning. But the way she was telling me now, the way her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's regretting not saying something sooner, I understood that she was offering me the fragment in a new context and hoping I could tell her what it meant. I couldn't yet. But I had a new data point and a sense that whatever Dominic knew, he'd known it for at least 18 months, which meant this wasn't a recent characterization. Which meant Ryan had been describing our relationship in some particular way to his friends since before he proposed to me, or at least since before the engagement became the main context. Which meant I needed to understand what he'd been saying and for how long and to whom. I went through my own memory next, which is a strange process because memory is not organized by relevance, it's organized by emotion, and I had to go through a lot of warm memories to find the ones with cracks in them. What I found was not dramatic, but it was consistent. Ryan's friend group had always been slightly separate from our relationship in a way I'd accepted as normal for a man who'd had friends since childhood. They had their own language, their own references, their own shorthand, and I'd never been fully inside it, which I told myself was fine because you don't need to be inside your partner's oldest friendships to have a real relationship. But now I was thinking about the times I'd been in rooms with those friends and trying to identify the moments where something had fell off in the way the gas station car ride fell off, and I found 3. One was a night out early in our relationship where I'd been introduced to someone in Ryan's circle, and the guy had looked at Ryan in a way that I remembered thinking was surprised, not unpleasantly but genuinely, like he hadn't expected to meet me. The second was a comment someone made about Ryan settling down that was funny enough to laugh at in the moment, but that now I could see had a specific texture to it, like the settling down was news. The third was Ryan himself, one night after a work event, saying something like my friends still can't believe I'm doing this, and I thought he meant getting married in general, the universal male ambivalence about commitment. But now I was wondering what specifically they couldn't believe. I made a decision that I want to acknowledge was not my finest moment, but that I'm not going to apologize for either. I got into Ryan's email. I knew his password because we'd shared it about a year earlier when I needed to pull up a confirmation he'd forwarded me, and he'd just told me the password instead of logging in himself, and he'd never changed it since. I sat in the apartment when he was at work and I opened his email, and I searched for Dominic's name, and what I found was not an affair, which is what part of me had been bracing for. It was something that in some ways confused me more than an affair would have. There were emails between Ryan and Dominic going back almost 2 years, regular correspondence, the kind between old friends, and in most of them nothing was remarkable. They talked about sports and work and plans and the usual things men who've known each other since childhood talk about. But in a thread from about 14 months earlier, a few months after we'd gotten serious, Dominic had asked Ryan point blank how things were going with Nadia, and Ryan had written back something that I read 4 times before I understood what I was reading, which was that things were good, but he wasn't sure it was going anywhere serious, that he liked her a lot, that she was fun, that he was taking it one thing at a time. This was 14 months ago. A year before the proposal. A year before he came home in his coat on a Thursday because he didn't want to wait for the right moment. Let me tell you what that email did to my understanding of the proposal. Because everything I described about that night, the kitchen, the wooden spoon, the Thursday-ness of it, the idea that he'd been carrying the ring around because he didn't want to overthink it, all of that now had a different possible interpretation. What if he hadn't been so confident that he jumped ahead of the perfect moment? What if something had changed his mind between 14 months ago and the proposal, some calculation I hadn't been part of? Some conversation or decision or shift in what he needed from his life that had moved me from not sure it's going anywhere serious to the person he came home to propose to. And if something had changed his mind, what was it? And did it have anything to do with what he was telling Dominic in texts about just for fun? And what had he told Dominic between that email and the proposal in the 14 months of correspondence I hadn't yet fully read? I went back through it. The thread between them was long, and I read all of it over 3 hours with a cup of coffee that got cold before I was halfway through, and what I found was a gradual shift in the language Ryan used about me, from the one thing at a time framing to something warmer, more certain, and then around the time of the proposal the tone changed again into something I couldn't quite characterize. Like he was talking about the engagement as a decision he'd arrived at rather than a feeling he'd followed. I want to be clear that I didn't yet know what I was dealing with. What I had was a text I wasn't supposed to see, a friend's memory of a fragment, a pattern of strange moments, and an email from 14 months ago where Ryan described our relationship as fun and not necessarily going anywhere. None of that was conclusive. People change. People are uncertain about relationships and then become certain. People describe things to their friends in casual shorthand that doesn't reflect the full complexity of how they actually feel. I knew all of this, and I held it alongside what I'd found, and I tried to be a fair reader of the situation, but the words still in Dominic's text kept pulling at me, because it implied that the just-for-fun characterization was current, that it was ongoing, that whatever Ryan had said to Dominic wasn't historical, it was present tense. And present tense changed everything. I decided to do something I was nervous about, which was to have a conversation with Cassie. She was the woman from the work dinner who'd looked at me with that careful quality, and I had a feeling she knew something, and I had her number because at some point someone had added me to a group chat for Ryan's birthday last year, and I'd never been removed. I texted her asking if she had time to grab coffee, framing it as wanting to get to know people in Ryan's world better since the wedding was coming up. She responded within 20 minutes saying yes, which told me she'd been expecting to hear from me. We met at a place near her office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I watched her across the table for the first few minutes, trying to figure out what she was going to do with whatever she knew. She was composed in the way people are composed when they've rehearsed for a conversation, and she was kind in the way people are kind when they feel guilty about something. We did about 10 minutes of small talk about the wedding planning and her own recent move and something going on with a mutual acquaintance, and then she went quiet for a moment, and I went quiet with her, and she said, "I'm not sure how to say this." And I said, "Just say it." What she told me was that Ryan had told Dominic, and Dominic had told Cassie and a few others in the friend group, that the engagement had happened partly because of pressure, not from me specifically but from his family. His parents had been vocal about wanting him to settle down, and there had been some financial implications around a family property that his grandfather had tied to certain life milestones, and Dominic's theory, which Cassie was careful to call Dominic's theory and not necessarily fact, was that Ryan had proposed when he did because the timing aligned with those external factors. She said she didn't know if that meant he didn't love me. She said she thought he probably did in his way. But she also said that Dominic had been saying for months that Ryan was going through with it, but still talked about the relationship like it was something he was managing rather than something he'd chosen completely freely. Still talked about it. Present tense, just like the text. I sat with what Cassie had told me for almost a week before I did anything with it. I want you to understand that this wasn't passivity. It was me trying very hard not to blow up my engagement based on Cassie's interpretation of Dominic's theory about what Ryan was feeling. Because that was 3 levels of removed from anything Ryan had actually said to me, and I'd always known that relationships look different from the outside, and that friends have their own biases and their own investments in how they categorize your life. So I sat with it. I went to a venue walkthrough with Ryan during that week and watched him carefully, looking for the managed quality Cassie had described, and what I saw was a man who seemed engaged and present and occasionally overwhelmed by the logistics, which was normal, which was what I'd always seen. I made dinner twice that week and we ate together and talked and nothing felt managed. I almost convinced myself that Dominic was a person with a theory and Cassie was a person who'd been carrying that theory uncomfortably for months, and that neither of them were reliable narrators of my relationship. I was very close to convincing myself of that when Ryan's phone was on the kitchen counter and a text came in from Dominic and the preview was visible and it said you tell her yet about the Harcourt thing, and Ryan saw me see it and for about 2 seconds he looked the way he looked when he came out of the gas station, just slightly off in a way you'd miss if you weren't looking, and then he picked up the phone and said sorry. Dominic's being annoying about something for work, and I said okay, and the evening continued. And I started trying to figure out what the Harcourt thing was. If you're following along and keeping track of how many things I was simultaneously trying to understand, I want to acknowledge that it was a lot. And that around this point I started writing things down in a notes app because I was losing track of what I knew versus what I suspected versus what I'd been told. The Harcourt thing was not immediately Googleable because I didn't know what it referred to, but I knew that Harcourt was Ryan's grandfather's surname, his mother's maiden name, and I knew that Cassie had mentioned a family property tied to life milestones. So I put those two things together and sat with the combination. Ryan's grandfather, who I'd met once at a family gathering early in our relationship, had died about 8 months before the proposal, and I remembered that there had been some complexity around the estate. Ryan had mentioned it vaguely in the way people mention legal and financial things they don't want to discuss at length. And I'd respected his privacy around it the way I always respected his privacy, and now I was reconsidering every instance of respected his privacy as potentially another gap in my knowledge that I'd politely agreed not to look into. I didn't know how to ask about the Harcourt thing without revealing that I'd seen the text and connected it to what Cassie had told me, so instead I called Ryan's sister Becca, who I genuinely liked and who I'd always thought was on my side in the uncomplicated way that good future sisters-in-law are, and I asked her to get lunch. Becca and I had lunch on a Friday, and it was the most informative conversation I had in the entire investigation phase. Partly because Becca assumed I already knew more than I did, and partly because she was the kind of honest person who doesn't realize they're being revealing until they've already revealed something. Within 20 minutes of sitting down, she mentioned the grandfather's estate and the way his will had been written, and what she described was this. Their grandfather had left the primary property, a house that had been in the family for decades, and that was apparently quite valuable to Ryan and his sister jointly, but with a condition attached to Ryan's portion. Specifically that he had to be married within 5 years of the grandfather's death or his share would pass entirely to Becca, which their grandfather had apparently thought was an incentive rather than a complication. Ryan's grandfather had died 22 months ago. The proposal had happened 14 months ago. If the condition existed and Ryan knew about it, and Becca was sitting here describing it to me in a lunch restaurant with the ease of someone who assumed this was shared information between us, then there had been a window of about 8 months between the grandfather's death and the proposal during which Ryan had been operating with this knowledge, and that 8-month window contained the email to Dominic where Ryan had described our relationship as fun and not necessarily going anywhere. I sat at that lunch table and did the math quietly in my head while Becca ate her salad, and I heard Dominic's text again inside my own skull. She's still just for fun, and I understood for the first time what I might actually be dealing with. I want to stop here and say something that I've had to keep reminding myself since all of this unfolded, which is that the math being suspicious did not make Ryan definitively guilty of anything. People genuinely fall in love on complicated timelines. People who start a relationship casually and describe it as fun can and do develop deeper feelings. The existence of a financial incentive does not mean the proposal was only about the financial incentive. I want to be fair to both the evidence and to the man I'd spent 3 years building a life with, because both deserve fairness, even when fairness is painful to apply. But I also couldn't ignore what the math suggested, which was that there was a version of my relationship where Ryan had come to a decision point, looked at his options, calculated the advantage of marrying me versus losing a substantial inheritance, and arrived at the proposal not from the clean place of Thursday evening certainty I'd always believed in, but from somewhere considerably more complicated. And the just-for-fun characterization wasn't just a casual description, it was possibly still his honest assessment of what we were, which he was maintaining in his friend group while performing something different at home. That possibility was the thing I needed to either confirm or dismantle before I did anything else. So I finally made the decision I should have made sooner, which was to have a direct conversation with Ryan. Not a confrontation exactly. A question, just one, to see where it went. By the way, if you've been watching for a while and haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. We put new stories up every week, and they don't always get announced ahead of time. Some of them just appear, and the only way to catch them is to already be following. Okay, the conversation. I chose a Sunday morning because Sunday mornings are when Ryan is most himself, relaxed and unhurried, when the week hasn't started yet and there's no external pressure pressing on him. We were having coffee in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd proposed with his coat still on, and I asked him, in the most neutral tone I could manage, what he knew about the conditions in his grandfather's will. I watched his face very carefully. What I saw was not panic, because Ryan does not panic. He does something more controlled than panic. He becomes very still, and his eyes do a small recalibrating thing, and then he decides on an answer. What he said was that there had been some stuff in the will about the property and that his lawyer was handling it. I said I'd heard there was a condition about being married, and I wanted to understand what that meant for us practically. He said, "Where did you hear that?" And I said Becca mentioned it at lunch, which was true and also conveniently placed the discomfort on Becca rather than on me, and he went still again and then said it was something they were figuring out, that it had factored into the timing of various decisions, and that it was complicated. I said the timing of which decisions, and he said of practical things, life things, and I said the engagement, and he didn't say no. He just looked at his coffee, and that absence of no was louder than anything he'd said. What came out over the next hour was not a confession exactly, but it was an admission in fragments. The way things come out when someone is deciding in real time how much to tell you. Releasing information in small controlled portions while trying to read how each portion lands. Ryan told me that his grandfathers will had a 5-year marriage clause, that he'd known about it since the estate was settled, that when we'd gotten serious, he'd had to think about how it aligned with where he thought things were going anyway. And that the proposal had been something he'd been planning regardless, but the timing had been influenced by the clause. He said influenced, not determined. He said he'd been going to propose anyway, that he loved me, that this was real. I listened to all of it, and I asked him one more question, which was what he'd been telling Dominic about our relationship. And there it was, the first real crack in his composure, the first moment where the stillness broke slightly, and he looked like a person who had been caught rather than a person who was being unfairly questioned. He said Dominic had a way of making things into jokes, and that he sometimes said things around Dominic that didn't represent how he actually felt. I said what kinds of things, and he said he'd probably been casual about describing us early on because that was how he was with Dominic and it hadn't caught up to where things actually were. I said, "Are you still being casual about describing us?" And he said no, and I said, "Then why did Dominic text you asking if you were going through with a wedding or if I was still just for fun?" The silence after that question was the longest silence of our relationship. I've had silences with Ryan before. We'd had arguments, we'd had bad nights, we'd had moments of disconnection that happen in long relationships, but those silences had always felt temporary, like pauses in something ongoing. This silence felt like an edge. He said he was sorry I'd seen that, and I said that wasn't the same as explaining it, and he said he knew. Then he said that Dominic didn't understand the relationship the way Ryan understood it, that Dominic was stuck in a version of things that was outdated, that Ryan had said things early on that Dominic had latched onto and never let go of. I said how early, and he said during the first year. I said, "What did you say during the first year?" And he said he'd probably said she's fun, just keeping it casual, the standard things guys say when they don't want to be questioned by their friends about a relationship. I said, "For how long did you describe it that way?" And he said he didn't know exactly, that it had evolved, that he'd stopped at some point and Dominic had just kept the framing even after Ryan didn't anymore. I said, "When did you stop?" And he said around when things got serious. And I said, "When was that?" And he said he wasn't sure exactly. And that's when I told him about the email from 14 months ago where he'd told Dominic things were good, but he wasn't sure it was going anywhere serious. You find out a lot about someone from the moment they realize you've seen something they didn't know you'd seen. What I found out about Ryan in that moment is that he had better damage control instincts than I'd ever given him credit for. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask how I'd seen it. He went quiet for another long moment, and then he said he'd been uncertain then, that was an honest email about where his head was at the time, that uncertainty wasn't the same as not caring about me. That he'd worked through the uncertainty and arrived at the proposal, and the proposal was real. I said, "Was the proposal also about the inheritance?" And he said it was complicated, and I said that's not an answer, and he said both things were true at once. The timing had factors, but his intention was real. And here's the thing, I believed part of that. I believed that Ryan probably had real feelings for me somewhere in the complicated structure of his motivations. I believed that I wasn't purely a financial calculation. But I also knew that real feelings existing alongside strategic calculations doesn't undo the strategic calculations, and I had spent 3 years believing I was someone he'd chosen without reservation. And that belief had been built on incomplete information, and the missing information changed the shape of the thing I thought I'd chosen to be part of. I asked him for a few days, and he gave them to me. He went to stay with his brother, and I stayed in the apartment, and I spent 3 days in a state that didn't feel like sadness exactly, more like disorientation. Like someone had taken a puzzle I'd spent 3 years solving and told me several of the pieces I thought were corners were actually middle pieces, and the whole shape of the thing was different from what I'd been building toward. Priya came over on the second day, and I told her everything. She cried, which surprised me because Priya doesn't often cry, and she said she wished she'd told me sooner about what she'd overheard at the party, and I said it wouldn't have been enough information then anyway, and she said she knew but she still wished it. My mother didn't know yet. I wasn't ready to tell her because telling my mother meant the situation would expand beyond just me and Priya and the apartment, and it would become something other people had feelings about, and I needed a little more time inside the smaller version of it. On the third day I called Becca and I thanked her for telling me about the will, and she was very quiet, and then said she'd assumed I knew, that Ryan had told her he'd explained it to me. And I said he hadn't, and she said she was so sorry, and I said it wasn't her fault, and she said I know but I'm still sorry, and I believed her, because Becca was the only person in this story who had given me information honestly and without an agenda. Ryan came back on a Thursday evening, which I noted without saying anything. I'd spent the 3 days arriving at a kind of clarity that wasn't comfortable, but was solid, the kind of clarity you reach when you've stopped hoping the information will rearrange itself into something more convenient. I knew what I knew. I knew he'd been describing me casually to his friends for a significant period of the relationship. I knew the proposal had been timed in part around a financial incentive he hadn't disclosed. I knew that Dominic, who was his oldest friend and the person whose characterization of the relationship he'd apparently never fully corrected, still thought of me as something casual. I knew that the version of the engagement that existed in Ryan's inner circle was not the same version that existed in my life. And I knew that the man who came home in his coat on a Thursday because he didn't want to wait for perfect had been giving his best friends a different story of what that Thursday was about. I let him sit down and I told him I needed to ask him one more question. I asked him what he would have done if I hadn't been willing to get married. If I turned down the proposal. Whether there would have been someone else he'd have moved toward with the same timing in mind. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said that wasn't fair. That wasn't how it worked, that you couldn't apply that logic to genuine feelings. And I said I agree, but you didn't answer the question. He didn't answer the question. I gave back the ring on a Saturday, which also feels like it should mean something, but probably doesn't. I didn't throw it or make a scene, I just took it off and put it on the kitchen table between us, and said I needed to not be engaged right now while I figured out what was true. He asked if this was over and I said I didn't know yet, which was honest, and he asked what would make it not over, and I said I needed to understand whether he'd genuinely chosen me or chosen a solution to a problem that I happened to be. And if it was the latter, then I didn't see a path forward, because I couldn't build a marriage on the foundation of being someone's convenient option. He said it wasn't like that, and I said I know you believe that, and I left the apartment, because I needed to not be in the same room as him while I felt the things I was feeling. The weight of the ring off my finger was the strangest physical sensation I've had in years. Not relief, not grief quite, just the strange specific absence of something that had become structural and was now just gone. The fallout was quieter than I expected and more complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ryan's friends mostly stayed with Ryan, which I'd predicted, with the exception of Cassie, who texted me to ask if I was okay, and who I responded to briefly and warmly. Dominic said nothing to me, which was appropriate since there was nothing for him to say, but I heard through Becca that he defended Ryan to people in their group in the way people defend someone whose position they created the conditions for. My mother took it harder than I did initially, the way mothers sometimes take these things harder than you do because they'd allowed themselves to imagine the future more concretely than you had, and she said things about Ryan that were harsher than I was ready to hear yet. Not because they were wrong, but because she was angrier than me at that point, and I hadn't caught up. Priya was steady and present and drove me to places when I didn't want to be alone in a car with my own thoughts, which is one of the most underrated forms of care that exists. Ryan and I talked twice more in the 2 weeks after the ring came off. Not arguments, just conversations, careful and tired, the kind you have when you're both trying to figure out if there's anything left to work with. What I understood by the end of those conversations was that Ryan did love me in the way people love things they are also using, which is not a clean category, but it's a real one. And that he had probably always intended to be a good husband in the practical sense, to be present and reliable and attentive. And that he had not understood until all of this collapsed that being chosen for complicated reasons is not the same as being chosen. The wedding venue had to be informed, which was a conversation I'll spare you the details of except to say it involves a lot of very polite emails about deposit policies. The engagement photographer who'd taken our official photos, which hadn't been posted anywhere public yet, sent a kind note when I canceled the remaining sessions. The registry we'd started had about 40 items on it, which I deleted one afternoon in about 4 minutes and found oddly satisfying in a way that probably said something about me. The practical dismantling of an almost wedding is its own specific experience, not traumatic exactly but strange, like reverse building something that took effort to build. And each piece you take down reveals that the structure was more elaborate than you'd fully registered while you were inside it. I dealt with each piece one at a time because that was the only way it was manageable. Ryan moved his things out of the apartment over a weekend when I was at Priya's place, and when I came home the spaces where his things had been were both more obvious and less painful than I'd expected. Mostly because I'd already been living with the emotional absence of him for weeks by then, and the physical space was just catching up. Here is what I want to tell you about the 6 months after all of it. The first month was the worst and most straightforward, the pure grief of it, the missing him and missing the version of us I'd believed in, which are not the same kind of missing, but which arrive simultaneously. The second month was when I started to be angry in a way that was useful rather than just painful, the kind of anger that helps you identify what you actually need and what you're no longer willing to accept. By the third month, I was spending more time thinking about my own patterns than about Ryan's choices, because Ryan's choices had already happened and couldn't be revisited, but my patterns were ongoing and mine to change. I realized I had a habit of respecting privacy in ways that allowed me to stay comfortably ignorant of important things. I realized I had a habit of explaining away discomfort by talking myself out of the feeling before I'd actually examined what was causing it. I realized I'd trusted Kayla, which is not her name, but is another story entirely. The point is I'd trusted people I'd categorized as safe without regularly verifying that the trust was still warranted. These are not catastrophic personal failures. They're patterns, and patterns can be adjusted once you've seen them clearly, and seeing them clearly required this entire experience to happen in exactly the way it happened, which I still don't know whether to be grateful for or just resigned to. What I know now that I didn't know when I was standing in Ryan's car reading a text I wasn't supposed to see is that being chosen is not enough information. You can be chosen for so many reasons, for convenience and timing and external pressure and genuine love all at once, and the presence of genuine love in the mixture doesn't automatically redeem the other ingredients, especially when the other ingredients were hidden from you and you were never given the chance to decide whether you wanted to be part of a mixture at all. What I deserved was the honest version, the one where Ryan said I have complicated feelings, I have real feelings and also practical considerations, and I don't fully know how to separate them, and I want to be honest with you about that. That conversation was hard to have, and he didn't have it, and I'm not sure I would have responded well to it if he had, but it was mine to respond to, and he took that away from me by managing the information. And what you lose when someone manages the information about your own relationship is not just trust in them, but access to your own choice. I didn't get to choose. I got a performance of certainty that was built partly on calculation, and I fell in love with the performance and the person at the same time, and now I have to separate them, which is the slow work of this year and probably some of next year too. I'm not with Ryan anymore. I want to be clear about that because stories like this sometimes end in reconciliation, and I understand why. I understand the appeal of the version where the complicated love is enough to overcome the complicated circumstances. And I'm not saying that version never works, but it wasn't my version. What my version looks like now is an apartment that's been mine again long enough to feel like mine, a job I've been throwing myself into in a way that feels like velocity rather than escape. A friendship with Priya that got stronger through all of this in the way friendships either do or don't when they're tested, and a relationship with my own instincts that is considerably more honest than it used to be. I don't discount the uncomfortable feeling anymore. I don't talk myself out of something that my body noticed before my brain did. I don't file things under doesn't require further investigation without actually verifying that they don't. These changes are not dramatic. They don't make for a triumphant ending where I'm doing something visibly different with my life. What they make for is a person who is paying closer attention to the information she already has, which is less cinematic but more useful, and usefulness is what I'm after now. The slow, useful work of knowing yourself better than you did before and building on that instead of on someone else's incomplete version of what you are to them. I was not just for fun. I was everything I'd ever been, in a situation that didn't have the full information, and now I have it, and I'm doing something with it, which is the only ending that was ever actually mine to write.